Chapter 10. "Harry!" Ron shouted, bursting into their shared room. Harry rolled his eyes in annoyance. He had just gotten dressed, after taking a very long, hot shower, which unfortunately hadn't been nearly as relaxing as he'd hoped. It was the day after his birthday, which had been great, despite a few minor incidents. The twins had left after dinner last night, as had Bill and Fleur, but Mr. and Mrs. Weasley would be staying for the remainder of the summer holidays, along with Hermione, Ron, and Ginny, and while everyone had tried to be friendly or at least polite yesterday for Harry's sake, they had no such qualms today. Ron and Ginny had glared at Draco all through breakfast, while Hermione had watched Harry like she was looking for signs of a mental breakdown or something. Draco, for his part, had mostly ignored everyone, acting all snooty and aloof and only talking to Harry. Sirius might have found the whole thing amusing if he hadn't been busy having a very heated, whispered discussion with Mrs. Weasley. Judging by the way they had both kept sneaking glances and pointing at the table, Harry had a pretty good idea what the argument had been about. Only Remus and Mr. Weasley had gotten lucky. They both had to leave early to do some work for the Order. Harry had really missed his friends, but now that they were here, he felt stressed out, having to listen to their accusations and rants about his new friendship with Draco. So he wasn't too happy about Ron barging in right now.
"You need to come down to the kitchen. The letters from Hogwarts just arrived."
Harry swallowed hard, realizing that those letters would include his OWL results.
"Okay, I'll go get Draco and we'll be right down."
Ron scowled at the mention of the blonde, but Harry ignored him and went to fetch Draco. When they entered the kitchen, Hermione had already opened her letter and was reading it, her lips moving silently. Next to her, Mrs. Weasley and Ginny were looking over Ginny's new book list, with Sirius watching from where he sat at the table. The three boys quickly opened their own letters. Harry unfolded the parchment with trembling fingers and read it through several times, a smile slowly spreading over his lips. He'd always known he would fail divination, and he was just glad he could finally drop the stupid subject. The dreadful history of magic was no big surprise either, considering he'd fainted halfway through the examination thanks to Voldemort sending him that vision about Sirius getting tortured, but he had passed everything else, and even achieved an outstanding in DADA. Looking up, he found Ron grinning at him.
"Only failed divination and history of magic, and who cares about them?"
he said happily, showing Harry his grades. Mrs. Weasley was beaming with pride. Ron had managed to get more OWLs than Fred and George combined. Hermione, however, seemed a bit disappointed that she only got exceeds expectation in DADA, in addition to her other 10 outstandings. Ron mocked her for it. Harry shook his head with a smile and turned to Draco.
"What about you?"
The blonde shrugged. "I got outstanding in charms and potions, 5 exceeded expectations, but only acceptable in astronomy, and I failed history of magic. Father wouldn't be pleased," he muttered.
"His opinion doesn't matter. What do you think?"
Harry wanted to know. "Well, I think I did all right."
"You can all be proud of yourselves," Sirius declared, coming over to ruffle Harry's hair affectionately. "This fell out of your envelope in case you didn't notice," he added with a grin, handing Harry a small badge. "I've been made Quidditch captain," Harry exclaimed in surprise. Ron and Draco hurried to congratulate him, though they both managed to glare at each other while doing so. "Well, I don't suppose we can put off a visit to Diagon Alley much longer." Mrs. Weasley sighed, drawing everyone's attention to herself. She didn't look happy about the prospect, and when Ron made a joke about you-know-who hiding behind a bookshelf, she actually yelled at him and threatened to leave him behind at Grimmauld Place. "Don't worry, Molly. Remus and I will be coming too. We'll make sure nothing happens to the kids, and I can ask Tonks or her mother to accompany us as well, if it makes you feel better," Sirius promised. Mrs. Weasley nodded reluctantly. "All right, we'll go tomorrow if that's okay with you. It's Arthur's day off, and I don't want to go without him." Sirius nodded and promised to check with the others. The rest of the day thankfully passed with no more outbursts from Mrs. Weasley and no other major incidents. Hermione was already stressing about the coming term, while Ron and Ginny kept making snide comments about Draco, much to Harry's annoyance. The blonde spent most of the day locked up in his room and only emerged for dinner, which was just as bad as breakfast had been. Early next morning, Bill Weasley stopped by to hand money bags to Harry and Hermione. Thanks to the tighter security measures, it took hours to get to a Gringotts vault these days, so he'd used his position as an employee to get the money for them. After another strained breakfast, Sirius, Remus, and the 2 Weasleys took the kids by side-along apparition to a street corner a few blocks away, where 2 of the special Ministry of Magic cars were already waiting.
The Weasleys and Hermione rode in the first car, while Sirius and Remus shared the second car with Harry and Draco. No one from the Order had been able to make it on such short notice, but they figured they should be okay. The cars took them to the Leaky Cauldron, from where they passed into Diagon Alley. A lot had changed since Harry had last been here, and not for the better. Most of the shop windows now had large Ministry of Magic posters pasted over them, obscuring the view of the goods within. A few shops were boarded up, while a number of shabby-looking stalls had sprung up along the street, seedy-looking wizards and witches selling amulets and other talismans. Mr. Weasley grumbled about them, but was quickly shushed by his wife. After a few discussions, the adults decided that Harry, Draco, Hermione, and Ron should go to Madame Malkin's with Sirius and Remus, while Mr. and Mrs. Weasley would take Ginny to Flourish and Blotts to get everyone's school books. Mrs. Weasley wasn't pleased about splitting up, but her desire to get the shopping done quickly obviously overruled her desire to keep all her children in sight. Harry noticed that all the shoppers were hurrying along in groups. He didn't see anyone alone, and no one stopped to chat or look at windows anymore. A dark shadow seemed to loom over the once peaceful Diagon Alley. For the first time this summer, the threat of Voldemort seemed all too real and all too close. They were the only customers at Madame Malkin's, so it didn't take too long. Hermione bought new dress robes, while all three boys bought new school robes, having grown taller over the summer. They met up with the others at the apothecary, where Hermione, Ginny, and Draco stocked up on potions ingredients. Harry and Ron wouldn't be allowed to take Snape's NEWT class, having only managed and exceeds expectations in their OWLs. After that, they ate a quick lunch, before buying a few more necessary things for school, and finally making their way to Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, the twins' joke shop, which was packed with customers and very noisy. Draco tried to linger by the door, but Harry grabbed his hand and pulled him along. George gave them a tour through the shop, telling Harry to take whatever he wanted without having to pay. After all, he had given them his Triwizard winnings as a startup loan, and pointedly glaring at Draco. Harry took some decoy detonators George thrust at him, as well as some instant darkness powder. Draco unsurprisingly didn't buy anything. When the combined glares all the Weasleys kept throwing his way finally got too much, he claimed that he needed fresh air. Remus offered to wait outside with him and steered him towards the door.
"Finally, I thought we'd never get rid of him," Ron commented loudly.
"Yeah, too bad Remus went with him. Otherwise, someone might have done us a favor and rid us of him for good," Ginny added with a nasty smirk. Harry had to fight the sudden urge to yell at them.
"I think I need some air as well. The noise in here is giving me a headache," he muttered instead.
Sirius clapped him on the shoulder.
"Come on, Prongslit, I'll take you outside."
He had no idea why his godfather was grinning. Deciding that the joke shop was probably reminding him of all the pranks he'd pulled in his youth, Harry shrugged it off and followed him to the door, ignoring the shrewd looks from Ron and Ginny. They found Draco and Remus waiting in front of the shop and went to join them.
"The noise was getting to me," Harry claimed again,
wondering at the knowing grin Sirius exchanged with Remus. He was distracted, however, when Draco suddenly gasped and stiffened beside him, staring at something across the street. Harry followed his line of sight and spied a pale woman with long blonde hair emerging from a cafe. Draco could tell exactly when his mother noticed him. Her eyes widened and her hand went to her mouth, as if to stop herself from calling out his name. For a few seconds they stared at each other. A part of Draco just wanted to run over and throw himself into her arms. He wasn't sure if it was fear or common sense that kept him rooted to the spot, and then his father stepped out of the cafe, and Draco flinched. Lucius spied him almost immediately, and his face darkened in anger. His hand twitched like he was itching to reach for his wand and curse his son. His lip curled as he glared at Draco in contempt. The boy felt paralyzed under the intense stare. He had seen it directed at himself often enough in the past, and it had always spelled trouble. He was fairly sure that his father would come over and beat him with his cane or hex him into oblivion if it wasn't for the many witnesses around. Lucius even took a step towards them, but Remus stepped in front of Draco protectively, while Sirius reached inside the jacket, ready to draw his wand. For a few tense seconds, Sirius and Lucius stared each other down, and the blonde boy expected curses to start flying any second. In the end, it was Lucius who turned away with a sneer. He grabbed Narcissa's arm roughly and dragged her away. Draco winced, knowing his mother would sport dark bruises tomorrow. He had felt that death grip on his own arm often enough. Remus turned to look at him, and he quickly averted his eyes. He didn't want to see the pity on the man's face, but he met Harry's eyes, already knowing he would find no pity there, only understanding. "Are you okay, Draco?" Remus inquired softly. The blonde only nodded. not trusting himself to speak yet. The encounter had shaken him up, more than he wanted to admit. When the others finally emerged from the joke shop, what felt like hours later, they made their way back to the leaky cauldron. Draco found himself flanked by Harry and Remus, with Hermione and the Weasleys in front of them and Sirius bringing up the rear. He droned out the chatter and laughter around himself, and only concentrated on putting one foot in front of the other. He couldn't allow himself to think about what had happened, knowing he might break down if he did. Harry kept walking close to him. Every now and then their arms brushed against each other, and Draco took comfort from those small, accidental touches. They were a reminder that he wasn't alone. And having seen the loathing in his father's eyes, he really needed that reminder. He may no longer be the Malfoy heir, but at least he still had a family. He had his Aunt Andromeda and his cousin Tonks, he had Sirius and Remus, and he had Harry. The Ministry cars were still waiting in front of the leaky cauldron. They took them back to the street corner where they had been picked up that morning, and from there they apparated back to the kitchen at Grimmauld Place. Draco immediately went up to his room, ignoring how Ginny tried to trip him when he walked past her. Putting his purchases down next to his trunk, he threw himself on the bed and buried his face in the pillow. Now that he was alone, he finally allowed himself to process what had happened. The look on his mother's face, like she longed to reach for him, but didn't dare to. The hatred in his father's eyes, how he had roughly dragged his mother away, the sinking feeling that she might very well end up in St. Mungo's again. He felt his eyes prickling and his throat tightening, but he refused to cry. He was stronger than that, damn it, and crying would get him nowhere. But then his door opened and shut again with a soft click, and footsteps padded closer. He turned in time to see Harry crawling into bed next to him. The younger boy reached for him tentatively, and Draco lost the battle with his emotions. Hiding his face against Harry's shoulder, he allowed the tears to fall. He had no more strength to fight them, and he also knew that he didn't need to. Harry had already seen him at his weakest and knew more about him than anyone else, and Harry understood. He wrapped both arms around Draco and just held him while he cried. Harry sighed softly, gazing at the boy in his arms. Draco had slipped into an exhausted slumber a while ago, half wrapped around Harry, his head pillowed on Harry's chest. The younger boy's heart broke a little at seeing his friend so distraught. And yet he was happy that Draco had opened up to him so much. The blonde was extremely proud. He had been taught not to show weakness and not to let his emotions control him. Harry felt privileged that he was allowed to see him like this, and amazed at the trust the older boy put in him. He hadn't thought twice about following the blonde upstairs earlier. His only wish had been to comfort him, and lying here with him like this felt strangely right. He was startled when the door opened a crack, and Sirius poked his head into the room. His godfather grinned, and Harry blushed, realizing for the first time how they must look, lying together in bed like this. Thankfully, Sirius didn't comment on their awkward position.
I told Ron and the others you weren't feeling well and wanted to lie down. I also warned them not to disturb you, the animagus let him know, and Harry gave him a grateful smile. He really couldn't deal with his friends right now. Do you want me to tell Creature to bring up your dinner?
The boy hesitated a second before nodding. He didn't want to put Draco through another meal with the Weasleys after this day.
That would be great if you think the others wouldn't get suspicious. Don't worry. Molly will probably make a fuss, but I'll keep her away. I'm a very good guard dog,
his godfather joked with a wink. Harry chuckled and thanked him.
Anytime, Prongslet,
Sirius assured him, before leaving again. You really don't need to stay here with me. The quiet words made Harry jump in surprise.
You're awake,
he stated quite unnecessarily. Draco pulled away from him and sat up. Harry instantly missed his warmth, but scolded himself for being stupid and sat up as well. I understand if you want to have dinner downstairs with your friends. I don't mind, Draco assured him. But Harry was still mad at his friends for treating the blonde so bad. He didn't want to see them right now, and he also didn't want to leave Draco alone.
I'd rather have dinner up here with you, if that's okay, but if you want to get rid of me...
No, stay, the blonde interrupted, and Harry smiled.